Asa, you had a breaking story this week. That was an update from the one that we talked about last week about the violent Israeli football fan thugs in Amsterdam, and more
Mm.
of the fallout on how the corporate media has capitulated to Israel's version of events.
Yeah, that's right, Nora. So I did. My latest story is titled "NY Times Killed Investigation of Israeli Hooligans Internal Email Reveals," and we managed to obtain an email, an internal New York Times email. And when I say obtain, the poor guy CC'd us by mistake. And it's it's kind of amusing in that way, but
Perhaps accidentally on purpose, sort of thing. Yeah. Yeah.
well, I mean, according to his manager, it was unintentional. So
Yeah.
we'll take that. Um, yeah. So it's
If
the
anyone else, sorry to interrupt you, Asa, if anyone else from the New York Times is watching and you want to contact us confidentially or
Mhm.
otherwise, or to inadvertently CC us anything, we're very happy.
Always open.
Always open, yeah.
yeah
My
yeah
DMs are open.
yeah exactly. Yeah, so it was the visual investigations reporter Christian Tribert. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing his name. He's a Dutch reporter, and essentially he followed up on some of the New York Times' initial reporting on this incident, where, as we reported last week in the stream, that essentially there was a pogrom, but it was a pogrom by Israeli football hooligans against Dutch citizens who showed any kind of support for Palestinians or were of Muslim or other migrant, backgrounds, heritages. So the violence was carried out by the Israeli football hooligans, the fans of Maccabi Tel Aviv. Here's the actual email on screen here from Christian Trubit. To be fair to him, it does seem that he tried to do the right thing, and he proposed an investigation at what he called a minute by minute visual investigation I was conducting into the events of the 6th to the 8th of November in Amsterdam. Unfortunately, that story was killed. He wrote, "I regret that the planned moment by moment visual investigation was not further pursued. This has been very frustrating to say the least." And it was addressed to Charlie Statlander, who was one of the people who I was talking to over email, trying to solicit comment on criticisms of the New York Times' highly misleading coverage, where they showed the opposite. They claimed it was an anti-Semitic attack and so forth, with no evidence. Incidentally, I discovered it had been previously reported by The Intercept that this New York Times spokesperson, basically a chief press officer in regards to newsroom and opinion, Charlie Statlander, he was also a former senior press officer for the NSA, the U.S. National Security Agency, spy agency, essentially, and also for the U.S. Army. So,
And he
the
was,
revolving door
Asa,
there.
if I'm not incorrect, he was also a spokesperson for the US-led occupation forces in Afghanistan.
That's
So, I mean,
right. Yeah.
this man is a professional defender of occupation and aggression and genocide.
Yeah, it's quite interesting what these kinds of people put openly on their LinkedIn profiles, boasting of these things that they've done. So yeah, the visual, the visual investigations reporter seemed to want to carry out a kind of reporting that would set the record straight, and that was killed. That was killed by the New York Times, and they've been on kind of damage control operations since then, and they've been denying this. Um, so once they realized that their email had been inadvertently copied to us, um, Statlander actually did follow up with me, and he tried to sort of downplay it and say, "Well, it wasn't actually killed. We just decided to use the reporting that he and his team had gathered and put it into another story." And there was a similar internal email obtained another internal email obtained by Ryan Grimm of Dropsite News, which put out by another editor, Phil Pan, who put out a very similar sort of spin internally within the New York Times, saying the same thing. And you can see it on screen here. You may have seen an article in the online outlet Electronic Intifada criticizing our coverage of the violence in Amsterdam and making the claim that we killed a visual investigation. I wanted you to know this is untrue. We merged material from the visual reporting effort with our reporting on the ground in Amsterdam in one story. The problem with that, as Ryan Grimm explains later on in this thread, and I explained in my article, is that it's simply not true. The article that they're referring to very much puts the emphasis on it's all just quotes of Israeli football hooligans saying, "Oh, we were attacked by anti-Semites." No evidence. No objective evidence is put forward towards it, and it really just reiterates the whole Israeli spin again. So
And Asa, just to point out a couple of things, which is that the word killed was not our word. That was the word that Christian Trebert, the New York Times reporter, used in that email to the New York Times' Charlie Statlander. It was
100%.
Christian Trebert who said to one of his superiors, "My story was killed." That's not my spin. That's not the Electronic Intifada spin. That's the words of the New York Times reporter who was preparing this investigation to one of his managers. And so look at the dishonesty in this internal email from New York Times editor Phil Pan, which presumably the aim was to sort of tamp down the disquiet among at least some of the New York Times staff at the way the newspaper is behaving. Because even if we know that the New York Times itself is a propaganda organ, there are some reporters like Christian Trebert who are trying to do the right thing. Christian Trebert seemed genuinely to want to set the record straight. And in that email as well, Asa, correct me if I'm wrong, Christian Trebert said that he contacted fellow journalists at the New York Times who'd written one of these stories about Amsterdam and said, I wrote to them to make them aware of inaccuracies.
Yeah, absolutely. That's correct. And you're right. It was his word killed. It wasn't our word. We were just quoting what he said in the email. And yeah, it does, there was a correction. I explained in my story. There was later, a few days later, there was a correction issued to this New York Times story once they realized that a video that they claimed was of Israelis being attacked by anti-Semites was actually of Israelis attacking a Dutch person, or at least a person in Amsterdam. And so, it showed the reality of that. It seems that it was Christian Trebert who alerted them to this, and that seems to have led to the correction, although it's kind of a half-hearted correction. Maybe tomorrow, if we can skip down we'll come back to the Andalou Agency story, but if we could skip down to the first draft. Thanks. If you go on archive.is, you can see the first draft of the New York Times, the initial New York Times report. Certainly the first draft that's still at least available. This was a breaking story, and these stories obviously develop online. This is the first one available. You can see the headline. It doesn't actually mention anti-Semitism in the headline yet, but in the sub-headline it does. And in this story, you can see if you read this version of the story, it's very, very clear that the paper had not only a pro-Israeli spin from the beginning, but they were taking their whole narrative from Israel, literally the Israeli government, specifically Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and Itamar Ben-Gvir. So there's a quote later. So it's very, very striking. There's no evidence in the story of anti-Semitism whatsoever. There's not even any claims of anti-Semitism apart from Israeli government ministers. So straight away, they're just taking the word of Israeli government ministers, the same lies they always make about anti-Semitism, and they just later on they're just making their report fit around the Israelis' claims. That's what happened. There's a couple of quotes in it that proved this. Quote: Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office said on Friday that he had ordered 2 planes to be sent to the Netherlands to assist Israeli citizens. Itamar Ben-Gvir, Israel's national security minister, said on social media Friday that Israeli officials were working with the Dutch authorities to investigate the attacks, which he said were driven by anti-Semitism. The next one, the Dutch police said in a statement on Friday that 57 arrests were made in connection with the unrest in Amsterdam. No claim of anti-Semitism there, although the Dutch police did later follow the Israeli narrative and claim that. The statement did not mention anti-Semitism or say whether anyone was targeted in the violence. This is the initial version of the story, remember. And then again later on, Mr. Ben-Gvir, Itamar Ben-Gvir, the Israeli National Security Minister, said that he was working with the Foreign Minister, Defense Ministry, etc., to rescue the Israeli citizens. Quote, this is Itamar Ben-Gvir speaking, fans who went to see a football game encountered anti-Semitism and were attacked with unimaginable cruelty just because of their Jewishness, he said. So what is very notable is in the next version of this story, a few hours later, all mention of Ben-Gvir has been taken out because, of course, as you know, as our viewers, most of our viewers, I'm sure, will know, Itamar Ben-Gvir, Israel's police minister, is a Kahanist extremist, Jewish supremacist who he has the same beliefs as a lot of Israeli ministers, but he's very crude about expressing them. In other words, that he wants to expel all Palestinians, and he says it openly. And so in that respect, he's kind of an embarrassment on the New York Times pages. And so they removed all mention of him from the next version. But it's very, very clear the narrative the New York Times was trying to put forward was coming straight from Israel from the beginning.
And the mayor of Amsterdam also came out this week, also saying the same thing, that words were put in her mouth by Israel.
Yeah, so much more seems to keep coming out about this story, and the narrative is being rolled back very, very quickly. And this is a point Ali makes, that it's very similar to the Israeli hoax about the mass rapes that never happened on the 7th of October 2023, that the whole Western media seemed to go with, but has just been debunked. And we have there's a story here from the Anadolu agency, the Turkish news agency, and it was reported in Holland as well, that the mayor of Amsterdam, who is a Green Party, a person from the Green Party, or at least was in the past. She may be independent now, I'm not sure. She went along initially with this Israeli narrative about anti-Semitic pogroms, and has now this week has recanted that. And the quote here is, "We were completely caught off guard by Israel," she told the Dutch broadcaster on Sunday. At 3 a.m, Prime Minister Netanyahu was already giving a lecture about what happened in Amsterdam. We were still gathering all the facts. And she expressed frustration with this. She described it as propaganda. That the idea that the Israelis were targeted. She emphasized that the term pogrom, which she used in a press conference, had been manipulated to serve political agendas. Quote, "If I had known it would be weaponized in this way, I would not have used that word," she said, acknowledging her regret over the term's unintended implications. I mean, the lesson for, liberal and, allegedly progressive politicians in the West is always assume Israel's lying, because why would you, it's like, if we take her at face value here, she will have learned a hard lesson here, but surely you should try and find out the truth and not just believe by default that there is anti-Semitism happening. It seems to happen. Western politicians seems to be fooled by this.
I don't know if they're fooled.
So much.
Are they fooled, Asa? Because
seems pretty willing. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's also not that, yes, there must be, and let me be clear, none of what I say is designed to absolve them or exonerate them. But I think a lot of them truly believe this. They truly believe the lies about October 7th that they spout. Perhaps Annalena Baerbock, the Green Party foreign minister of Germany, truly believes she watched a non-existent video filmed by Hamas of its own men raping Israeli women on October 7th. Maybe she really believes that. I think they are so steeped in their racist and dogmatic ideology that they're unable to exist outside of it. And as far as the New York Times is concerned, and this is true of a lot of other media, I've seen a lot of friends in the Netherlands commenting on how Dutch media played an exactly similar role in spreading this hoax. And more than that, inciting hatred and fear and violence against Dutch citizens and residents of the Netherlands of Arab, Moroccan, Palestinian background by falsely presenting them as, violent people who are running around Amsterdam looking for Jews to beat up. And as you pointed out in your story, Asa, in your write-up of this, the New York Times ran with headlines that like a global Jew hunt. That was one of their headlines. So
it's the same narrative of Geert Wilders of the far right.
Yeah.
yes,
Dressed up in New York Times.
The original Donald Trump with the crazy hair, that's important to point out, because we have all these European liberals expressing utter horror at how could Americans elect Donald Trump instead of that nice lady Kamala Harris, when they invented it. They invented Donald Trump. Jean-Marie Le Pen, Geert Wilders, all these far-right figures, and of course now Marine Le Pen, his daughter, but across Europe, who are exploiting this kind of this atrocity propaganda, bringing it home to Europe. So it's a way to say, Netanyahu's claim is always that we in Israel are. I'm not allowed to do. I shouldn't do impression, but Benjamin Netanyahu. I can do a Benjamin Netanyahu.
With his Philadelphia accent.
Yeah. We are on the forefront of Western civilization. We are fighting the barbarians here, so you don't have to fight them in the streets of America and Europe. And this allows them to extend that narrative to say, look at these savages and barbarians on the streets of Amsterdam or wherever else it might be. And also this week, the German police, the police in Berlin, put out a warning saying that LGBTQ people and Jews should be wary in Arab neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. And this is absolutely disgusting, racist incitement by the German police, because those neighborhoods where people of refugees, people of a migrant background live, they are the principal victims of German state racism and societal racism. And I wrote about this a couple of years ago for the Electronic Intifada, I think in 2021. After that Israeli rampage in Gaza in May of 2021, the German police issued a report, comprehensive statistics showing that the rise in what they define as anti-Semitism, because all of these definitions shift all the time and are politicized, but the rise in anti-Semitism in Germany, they said they'd seen a surge. It almost entirely came from the far right and had absolutely nothing to do with Arabs or immigrants or Muslims. That's it. That's the story. It was actually before, it was before the May 2021 war. It was in February 2021. But this was based on German police statistics. And there's no reason to think that has changed at all. The only thing that has changed is that there is even more right-wing extremism, even more anti-Arab and anti-Muslim hatred and incitement. And this Amsterdam hoax, just like the mass rape hoax of October 7th, is about portraying Arabs and Muslims, people of color, people from Africa, anyone who's not of, what they would consider a European background, to be barbarians and animals and a threat, and to justify this hatred and violence against them.
I also take it to be, Israel's actions in the last couple of weeks. I also take it to be essentially an op against the solidarity movement in Europe, because for more than a year they have not been able to. Western governments have not been able to stop protesters coming out on the streets. Even in Germany, where the most extreme oppression has been going on, people are still coming out. And activists get very dispirited. These demonstrations haven't stopped the genocide, obviously, and people sort of think it's pointless. And maybe it is not directly stopping any war materials being shipped to Israel, as Palestine Action is doing, and so forth. But I do think these things make a difference. I do think that it increases the pressure on Israel, and so there's no doubt that Israel is trying to stop these things happening. And in that regard, to me, it's very much like what the Israel lobby carried out against Jeremy Corbyn when Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the opposition. They tried to stop him becoming the prime minister, and in my view, they succeeded in doing that. They were at least certainly one of the primary reasons Jeremy Corbyn didn't become the prime minister of Britain. And it's it's the same narrative as where in the mainstream media it is just one of these pro-Israel lobbyists, one of these Zionist fanatics just has to say, oh, this is anti-Semitism. Any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism. It's quite often targeted, as you're saying, Ali, against people of color, against Muslims, against Arabs in the West, and so forth. And there's this idea that they're all anti-Semites. This is something that is spread very consciously by Israel as a weapon against them and against solidarity movements, and it can be quite effective for them, has to be said.